We'll move.
A positive feedback loop is a system where one variable increases the quantity of another variable, and that second variable, in turn, increases the first variable, creating an exacerbating loop. Think about investments in a bank, right? You have a certain amount of money in your bank account, and that leads to you accruing interest, and that interest leads to a higher amount of money in your bank account, which leads to more interest, which leads to more money in your bank account, and so on and so on, and suddenly, you're a millionaire. So that's not how it works, but that's how positive feedback loops work. And there are positive feedback loops all around us, whether it's in biology or investments in banking or even in transportation policy. I remember when I was 16 and I got my driver's license and I was super excited to go to places like this, the mall with your friends. That was really exciting to me, even though, it's not that exciting right now, especially at this time of year, but it's what media idealizes. The entire idea of being able to drive where you want is something that every 16-year-old looks up to. Truthfully, we view cars as freedom, as keys to the outside world, to get to places like this. But we don't have to build giant, sprawling parking lots that are half empty all the time in order to get to malls. We don't need that. So many of the issues that we face in our cities right now can be directly tracked back to cars, whether it be pollution, traffic, or social inequity. And it's the car-centric infrastructure that make all of it worse, whether it be the giant sprawling parking lots like this, the widening of lanes, or our terrible inefficient land use. In short, we're living in a positive feedback loop where we have built bad car-centric infrastructure. That car-centric infrastructure has caused us problems, and we solve it by building more car-centric infrastructure. And that's just completely insane. So we need to be able to break the cycle of all the bad things in our society being exacerbated by our car-centric problems, or else the loop will just keep on repeating.
You must break the pattern today, or the loop will repeat tomorrow. You must break the pattern today, or the loop will repeat tomorrow. Break the pattern today, or the loop will repeat. Break the pattern today, or the loop will break the pattern today. Break the pattern. Break the pattern. Break the pattern. Break the pattern. Break.
We talk about cars being freedom for Americans, but is it really freedom to have to pay 4 to 5 figures on a car and then thousands every year to maintain it? Is that freedom to just need to do that just to get to work? Is it freedom to have to drive literally everywhere, and if you can't afford to drive, have your opportunities limited tenfold? I would say no. But let's think about it for a second. You love cars because it makes you feel free. Why does it make you feel free? Because you can drive anywhere you want. Well, why can you drive anywhere you want in a car and not anything else? Like, why is a car the most easy way to get around? It's because we purposely built America in that way. For many people, using a car isn't necessarily a freedom, it's a burden. And it's a burden because it's the only thing that they can use. We know the story. After World War II, a booming economy with a young workforce was born, and with that came demand for personal automobiles. People like Alfred Sloan, then president of GM, led the way for cars to come into the cultural mainstream. And right away, we fundamentally changed our country's infrastructure to be in line with personal vehicles. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 helped encourage huge interstate highways to be constructed across America, connecting the suburbs to the urban core, and subsequently destroying the historical neighborhoods of a lot of black and poor families. We ended up spending $50 billion on road construction every single year from 1956 to 1991. We also established zoning laws to require different land uses in an area. Most notably, this meant that the suburbs were mostly single-family homes, far away from any retail and commercial space, basically making it impossible for people to get anywhere without a car. And in reality, the story is a lot bleaker than that. Car companies, big oil, other companies that would benefit from having car-centric infrastructure have long lobbied Congress, spending millions of dollars in order to enact pro-car laws. In the early 1900s, they worked in order to enact jaywalking laws that made it illegal to use the street in any other manner other than drive a car. So instead of having a multi-use street, we prioritize the car over other people. They purposely made funding projects for bike lanes and public transit very, very difficult, while at the same time purposefully subsidizing these huge highways, like under the Federal Highway Act, in order to up our car-centric infrastructure. We as a country love cars because it's been a part of our culture for a long time. And that's not a hot take, obviously. But car ownership wasn't always a part of American culture. It was purposely put there by those other big companies. In the 60s, maybe building all these parking lots and all these highways would be a sign of prosperity and a sign of progress. But as we've gone on 60 years after the fact, we're quickly realizing that it's doing a huge detriment to our society rather than it being a huge help. So that was the first part of the cycle, the beginning where we build the car-centric infrastructure. But then the second part is the actual problems that come up from that infrastructure. And when you actually think about it, a lot of our modern problems get caused specifically by cars. Like, we can look back and see how much cars have really ruined our cities. Many cities or municipalities have parking lot minimums. Basically, every single store, restaurant, any establishment in general, apartment maybe, has to have a certain amount of parking lot spaces per square footage of that said establishment. That's roughly how it goes. As of 2018, shops in California were required to provide 288 square feet of parking space for every 250 square feet of retail. In LA, this has created 3.3 parking spaces for every single car in the city. And when you take a step back and see how this has affected cities in the macro view, this has caused 30% of the Sunbelt cities, which LA is a part of, to be devoted to parking and parking alone. This causes businesses, homes, and retail to be extremely, extremely spaced apart, which hurts how walkable our cities are. Then you really start thinking about it, and you think to yourself, well, if this was all just in one area, we wouldn't have to drive everywhere. You know, it takes such a long time to have to drive across the entire city to get to restaurants, to get to stores that could have been right next to each other. But having cities that aren't accessible, aren't walkable, really hurt minority and low-income communities the most. Because those communities are the most likely to not be able to afford a car. So if all of our infrastructure is built on having cars, then, well, those communities are inherently cut out. So our parking lots and our bad land use in general don't just affect how convenient things are, but have like real world economical, socioeconomical effects. Once companies like GM really entrench car culture into our greater culture, cars become very hard to shake. Just think about it. You already have car-centric infrastructure. You know, you're not just gonna dump that. You're gonna keep on building more car-centric infrastructure because it already exists. And that's the issue. Instead of looking towards better land use, better use of those parking lots, you know, building more buildings there or what have you, maybe more public transit lines in that area, our mind automatically goes to how can we use car-centric solutions to solve our car-centric problems. And this kind of paradoxical loop exists not just with parking lots, because obviously parking lots are not the only form of car-centric infrastructure, but the main form of car-centric infrastructure, highways as well. Just take a look at how we view highway expansion, right? With the Federal Highway Act of 1956, you start with a couple lanes of highway. In residential areas, you have, you know, roads and streets that make up the county highways, the city streets, whatever. And at first, that works out. That's good. You have the right amount of congestion, the level of service is good, everything is perfect. Nothing to worry about. But because of our poor land use with parking lots and whatever, and our suburbanization as a whole, more and more people need to drive, which causes those highways to become congested, to, have too many cars, not enough space. So as a smart, logical person who is living in 2022 or whenever you're watching this, you might say, well, in order to solve this congestion, maybe we should add some bike lanes to this street in order to more efficiently move people in ways that are more space efficient. Or maybe you'll even say, this is a busy highway. Maybe we put in a transit line, which more efficiently moves people with less vehicles. That's a pretty logical way of looking at things. However, that's not the way that we politicians, companies that are entrenched in car-centric infrastructure, or even the general public look at these problems. Instead, we add more and more lanes. Add a lane, sure, and suddenly, congestion frees up because you have more space for cars to drive. But that in itself incentivizes travelers who otherwise wouldn't drive, or maybe were driving another route, to use this new and improved route that has, better travel time. And suddenly, you're right back where you started. This is called induced demand, and it's a phenomenon that is so widely studied, so widely proven, that it's taught as pretty much a fact in transportation engineering classes. And even though it is widely proven that adding a lane does not improve congestion, it just makes sense to us because we can only think in the context of a car. So all of our solutions have to involve doubling down on our car-centric infrastructure. And so what we end up getting are very, very wide highways, sometimes cutting through the suburbs where there should be a lot of people walking, and we make those areas worse because we widen the roads, having to tear down any homes, businesses, or trees in the area, while at the same time not helping our congestion at all. In fact, in some cases, making it worse. So again, continuously, we keep on shooting ourselves in the foot. See, as we ramp up our anti-climate change movement, it's important that we take a look at literally every sector that emits carbon on a large scale, and one of them happens to be transportation. Transportation is a huge contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. Road vehicles account for 22% of CO2 emissions, 30% of the emissions of PM 2.5, and 50% of PM 0.1. Yet as a whole, we as a country have not really come to terms with the fact that our own personal car usage affects everything, right? Necessarily the general public, because I feel like most people understand that cars are bad for the environment. But I'm more talking about the people who are in power, who kind of spit out this greenwashed version of environmentalism with cars. Instead of reducing our vehicle miles traveled, which would help probably the most with personal vehicles and their CO2 outputs, help reduce that the most, instead they spout out the fact that we need to electrify cars, and the fact that, actually freeway expansion is good because that means that congestion is low, which means idling is decreased, which means that overall CO2 output is decreased. All of that in some way or the other is only a partial solution to a larger issue. But the biggest solution is still ignored, which is simply reducing vehicle miles traveled. And so, until we can actually come to terms with the fact that we need to look beyond the car in order to, help our environmental movements, we're going to be, again, shooting ourselves in the foot continuously. Cars have kind of made us selfish, and it makes sense. You don't really think about anyone else when you're driving, but it causes us to turn our backs on the people who need it most, whether it be people who need that affordable housing, that need to walk and bike on the streets, because car ownership has such a stranglehold on our culture that even the most open-minded, most progressive people still, in some part of their mind, defend car ownership, even if they know that it's bad for their community, even if they know that it's bad for their environment, if it's bad for their own selves in general, they'll still defend it because that's the only thing that they know. They can't think of a possible community, a possible world that doesn't involve them having to drive everywhere. So they'll turn their back on the people who need it most. But they'll always caveat it with, I care about this issue, but I need my car. It's almost universal that that's how it goes, right? They'll say their excuse is usually that this is just the system that we live in. This is the system that we know. As if there doesn't exist any other place in the world that can do it better. Like, when we look around, is this what we wanted America to be designed like? For the construction companies, big oil and automobile manufacturers, the answer is probably yes. But for us, everyday people, do we look out the window and are happy with what we see? Like, do we like not being able to walk anywhere, having to drive, spending thousands of dollars just to go to the grocery store, to go to the gym? Do we like the majority of our suburbs to be either roads or parking lots, to the point where the suburbs are just painfully boring because there's just nothing to do, because everything is just so spaced apart? Do we like, not letting our kids outside because 1/5 of all children killed in a traffic accident weren't even the ones in the car? They were the ones trying to cross the street or were playing on the side of the road. We are purposely making our roads way, way more dangerous than they have to be. Do we like forcing our seniors who can't drive to fend for themselves crossing the street against 50-mile-per-hour traffic? Because 20% of all pedestrian deaths were people aged 65 or older. See, our roads are purposely hostile to those who need it most in order to make car commutes faster. Yet instead of trying to decrease car-centric infrastructure, we build more roads because cars are more important. To be honest, it's just not on car owners' radars that we are purposely putting those most at risk in harm's way. Because we can look at the statistics. We can see that car accidents are the leading cause of death for teenagers, and we can still brush that under the rug. It's crazy to me that when you're driving at all times, you are a couple angles to the left or to the right away from just dying. That your survival is dependent on the cooperation of thousands of other drivers sharing the road with you. And I'm not saying that we should take no risks. It's just that overall, when you look at all the negative externalities, every single time you look at them, it's so clear that they outweigh any of the positives that cars were supposedly supposed to give us. Throughout our entire history in this country, we have personally villainized people who can't drive, who don't drive, because they stand in the way of our commute. And that's just something that needs to change.
At the end of the day, getting rid of this cycle is not going to be easy, but it's something that we just truly have to do. And that begins with us recognizing this is a problem. My point with this video wasn't necessarily to come up with solutions, even though we do have solutions. And that solution is going to be long, it's going to be arduous, but it needs to happen in some way or the other. The main point of this video was to highlight the issues of our car dependency and how really it's us shooting ourselves in the foot. So we need to be able to stop this again, or the loop will just repeat tomorrow.
You must break the pattern today, or the loop will repeat tomorrow. You must break the pattern today, or the loop will repeat.